I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
Thermometer on the stoop of the brownstone was struggling to stay above 10 degrees, which is exactly where my enthusiasm for leaving the house was hovering. It was a Tuesday in mid-January, the kind of New York morning that feels like it was designed by a refrigeration engineer with a grudge. I was in the office making sure the typewriter hadn't frozen solid and wondering if Fritz would consider an early lunch of onion soup when the doorbell rang. I looked through the one-way glass and saw a man who looked like he had been carved out of a block of very expensive, very cold marble. He was wearing a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than my first car and a silk scarf tied with the kind of precision that usually requires a degree in structural engineering. He wasn't just standing there, he was vibrating with a restrained high society sort of panic. I opened the door and the cold air hit me like a slap from a jealous ghost. "If you're selling the North Pole, we already have some in the basement," I said. "If you're looking for Nero Wolfe, he's currently upstairs in the plant rooms where it's 10,000% more tropical than here. He won't be down until 11. The man stepped into the hallway without waiting for an invitation, which is a great way to start off on Wolfe's bad side. "My name is Marshal Sterling. I am the chairman of the Winter Gala Committee. Something unthinkable has happened. The gala is tonight, and the centerpiece of the evening, the glacier diamond, has been replaced by a counterfeit. But that isn't the worst of it." "No?" I asked, helping him out of his coat, while trying not to let him see me wince at the price tag. "Did someone forget the shrimp cocktail?" Sterling looked at me with eyes that were as hollow as a bankrupt safe. "Someone has poisoned the executive chef, and they did it using a shipment of saffron that was delivered directly to this house by mistake yesterday. My chef is in the hospital, and I have 300 of the city's most powerful people arriving at the Waldorf in 8 hours. Mr. Wolfe's name was on the delivery manifest. I felt the itch in my palms that usually means a long day is ahead. A poisoned chef and a missing diamond were bad enough, but bringing Fritz's kitchen into the middle of a criminal conspiracy was like throwing a match into a fireworks factory. "Wait here," I said, and I didn't mean it as a suggestion. I went to the house phone and buzzed the plant rooms. When Wolfe answered, he sounded like a man who had just discovered a caterpillar on his favorite cattleya. "Yes, Archie, we have a problem just walking off the ice," I said. "A Marshal Sterling. He says his chef was poisoned by a batch of saffron that was delivered here yesterday. He also says a diamond is missing, but he seems more upset about the soup. He's in the office and he's currently breathing our air." The silence on the other end lasted 5 full seconds. Not because Wolfe was thinking, he does that at the speed of light, but because he was deciding whether to be annoyed or intrigued. The fact that his own house had been used as a way station for a poisoner tipped the scales. "Bring him to the office, Archie. I shall be down in 1 minute." When the elevator door opened, Wolfe stepped out looking like a massive, yellow-vested thundercloud. He didn't look at Sterling. He walked straight to his desk, sat in the chair that was built to withstand a small earthquake, and adjusted his blotter. He didn't offer a hand or a greeting. "Mr. Sterling," Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble, "you suggest that my kitchen, managed by the most meticulous chef in the Western Hemisphere, has been used as a conduit for murder?" Sterling flinched. "Not murder, thankfully. Chef Julian is alive, but he is incapacitated. Saffron arrived on 35th Street yesterday afternoon. My secretary says it was a clerical error. The supplier confused your account with the Galas, but the package that arrived at the Waldorf this morning was laced with a concentrated dose of digitalis." Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. I knew that look. It's the look he gives a rare orchid that's showing signs of rot. He wasn't interested in the Winter Gala or the diamond, but someone had touched his world. Someone had messed with a shipment of spices intended for his table. "Archie," Wolfe said, not taking his eyes off Sterling, "check the pantry. Fritz received a shipment of saffron yesterday at 4 o'clock. If it is still there, I want it analyzed. If it is gone, I want to know who took it." "I took it, Mr. Wolfe," a voice said from the doorway. Fritz was standing there, his face as pale as a fresh meringue. But it wasn't for us. A messenger came back for it 20 minutes after it arrived, saying it was a mistake. I gave it to him. Wolfe's fingers began to tap, tap, tap against the arms of his chair. The sanctity of the brownstone had been breached. The domestic routine had been used as a cover for a high society heist. "We take the case," Wolfe announced, though it sounded more like a threat than an agreement. "Not to find your diamond, Mr. Sterling, though I suppose that will be a tedious necessity. We take it because someone has used my home as a locker for their malice. Archie, get your coat. We are going to find out who had the audacity to play courier in my hallway." I reached for my hat. The quiet morning was dead. The Winter Gala conspiracy was officially open for business, and it smelled like burnt saffron and cold ambition. The office was suddenly far too crowded for a man who considers the presence of more than 3 people a sociological disaster. Marshal Sterling remained perched on the edge of the red leather chair, looking like he expected the walls to start closing in, while Wolfe sat behind his desk with an expression of monumental stillness. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a very expensive lecture or a very clever trap. I stood by the door, watching the street through the window, while Fritz lingered in the hallway, looking like he wanted to apologize to every spice jar in the building for allowing a stranger to touch the inventory. The ice on the threshold wasn't just the freezing slush outside, it was the chilling realization that the brownstone's perimeter had been bypassed. For someone to know about a specific delivery to this address, and to have a messenger ready to correct the mistake 20 minutes later, meant we weren't dealing with a lucky thief. We were dealing with a choreographer. "Mr. Sterling," Wolfe began, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of quiet, dangerous precision. "You mentioned a counterfeit diamond. The Glacier diamond is a 60-carat stone of exceptional clarity, currently owned by the Van Heusen estate, but loaned to your committee for the evening. If it was replaced by a replica, when was the last time the original was verified?" Sterling wiped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief, despite the room being a comfortable 70 degrees. "Last night, at the final committee rehearsal at the Waldorf, the security team, led by a man named Harrison Vane, locked it in the portable vault. This morning, when Chef Julian collapsed and the police arrived to investigate the kitchen, Vane insisted on a second check. The stone in the vault was glass, excellent glass, but glass nonetheless." "And the saffron?" Wolfe asked. "Why use such an exotic medium for poisoning?" "It's the signature dish," Sterling whispered, "the glacier risotto. It's a tradition. The saffron provides the golden hue. Without the chef and saffron, there is no gala. Whoever did this wants to paralyze the event as much as steal the gem." Wolfe's eyes moved to Fritz, who was still hovering. "Fritz, the messenger who retrieved the package. Describe him." Fritz entered the room, his hands twisting his apron. "He was unremarkable, Mr. Wolfe. Average height, grey uniform, no insignia. He had a clipboard with a manifest that looked identical to the one I signed for the delivery. He knew the tracking number. I had no reason to doubt him. Which means," I chimed in, leaning against my desk, "the leak is at the supplier's end, or someone has been reading our mail. And since our mail is usually just bills and invitations to things you won't attend, I'd bet on the supplier." The front doorbell rang again, a sharp, insistent command. I checked the one-way glass and saw a familiar silhouette, Inspector Cramer. He was wearing his heavy overcoat and looked like he'd spent the morning chewing on a cold cigar and a grudge. I let him in, and he marched into the office without waiting for a greeting, his eyes landing on Marshal Sterling with a look of weary recognition. "I might have known," Kramer barked, ignoring Wolfe entirely for the first few seconds. A chef in the ICU, a $50 million rock gone missing from the Waldorf, and I find the chairman sitting in Nero Wolfe's office. "What is this, Wolfe? A private reunion for the victims of the Winter Gala?" "It is a consultation, Inspector," Wolfe said, not even blinking. "And it is an intrusion. Since you are here, perhaps you can tell us if your technicians have found the secondary delivery of saffron, the one that actually arrived at the Waldorf." Kramer pulled a chair and sat down, his jaw set. "We found it. laced with enough digitalis to stop a bull's heart, and we found something else. A note tucked into the bottom of the tin. It had your name, Wolfe. Just 3 words. Compliments of the season. The silence that followed was so heavy you could have weighed it on a produce scale. Someone wasn't just stealing a diamond, they were taunting Nero Wolfe. They had used his kitchen as a way station and his name as a signature for an attempted murder. I saw the muscles in Wolfe's jaw tighten. Intellectual play had just become a personal insult. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice as cold as the ice on the stoop. "Mr. Sterling is staying with us throughout the afternoon. I want the front door bolted. No one enters or leaves without my express permission. And call Saul Panzer. I want him at the Waldorf, undercover as a floral arranger. If there is a counterfeit diamond in that vault, I want to know who has been handling the glass." "You can't just take over a crime scene, Wolfe," Kramer protested, though he didn't move to leave. "I am not taking over a crime scene, Inspector. I am defending my reputation. Someone has utilized my home to facilitate a theft. I shall provide you with the thief, but the method of the exposure will be mine." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing. He was already moving the pieces on a board only he could see. The brownstone was no longer a sanctuary, it was a fortress under siege, and the enemy was someone who knew our routines well enough to play them like a piano. I looked at Sterling, who was staring at Wolfe as if he were a god of vengeance, and then at Kramer, who was just looking for someone to arrest. The winter gala was only hours away, and the ice was starting to crack. By the time Marshal Sterling had been settled in the front room with a bottle of beer, he didn't look like he knew how to drink, and a stack of horticultural journals he definitely didn't want to read. The office had transformed into a war room. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his fingers interlaced over his middle, staring at the empty air as if he could see the suspects lined up against the bookshelves. I sat at my desk with a fresh notepad, ready to populate the gallery of rogues who had decided that a Tuesday in January was the perfect time to play games in Nero Wolfe's kitchen. "The circle, Archie," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low melodic rumble. "We must identify the individuals who possessed the 3 requirements for this charade: access to the Waldorf vault, knowledge of the gala's culinary logistics, and the audacity to intercept a shipment at my door. Mr. Sterling's committee is a pond of stagnant water. Let us see what rises to the surface." I looked at the list Sterling had provided. First on the list is Harrison Vane, the security chief. He's ex-military, carries himself like he's guarding the crown jewels, and he's the one who insisted the diamond was glass this morning. He has the only secondary key to the portable vault. Wolfe grunted. "A man who announces a theft is often the man who timed it. Who else? Then there's Julianne Van Heusen," I said, tapping my pen against the pad. "She's the niece of the estate that owns the Glacier diamond. She's currently in debt up to her pearls from a string of bad investments in European textiles. She was at the rehearsal last night, and according to Sterling, she was the one who suggested the Glacier risotto needed a specific grade of saffron. A suggestion that provided the medium for the poison," Wolfe remarked. "And the third? Avery Thorne, the gala's event coordinator. He's a perfectionist with a temper that could melt ice sculptures. He's the one who handled the logistics for the deliveries. He would have had the tracking numbers and the supplier's schedule. If anyone could have diverted a package to the wrong address and sent a messenger to correct it, it's Thorne. And the fourth? A man named Marcus Bell. He's a silent partner in the catering firm. He's a ghost in the records, but he's been seen huddling with Harrison Vane in the Waldorf lobby. He's the one who provided the messenger service for the committee's last-minute errands." Wolfe's eyes opened fully, a sign that the mental machinery was beginning to hum. A security expert with a key, an heiress with a motive, a coordinator with the data, and a ghost with the means. A quartet of treachery. Each of them has a reason to want the gala to fail, or at least to provide a distraction long enough for a 60-carat stone to vanish into the night. "But why the poison, Wolfe?" I asked. "If you've already got the diamond, why try to stop the heart of a chef? It seems like a lot of extra work for a guy who's already won." "The poison was not intended to kill Archie. It was intended to paralyze. By incapacitating the chef, the thief ensured a period of absolute chaos. In the confusion of a medical emergency and a closed kitchen, diamond safety protocols would be secondary to the employee's life. It was a smokescreen, but one that required a very specific timing. And the note, "Compliments of the season," that was not for the police, it was for me. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. They wanted me to take the case. They wanted the great Nero Wolfe to be occupied with the mystery of a diverted spice tin, while the real transaction takes place under the cover of the Gala itself. They have invited me to the party, Archie. It would be churlish not to attend. You at a gala? I nearly fell out of my chair. The only way you're getting to the Waldorf is if they move the hotel to 35th Street. You don't even like leaving the office to go to the bathroom. I shall not be attending in the flesh, Archie. I shall be attending through you and through Saul Panzer. But I must first shake the trellis to see which of these birds flies first. I want you to go to the Waldorf. Do not look for the diamond. It is likely already miles away or hidden in plain sight. I want you to find saffron tin, not the one the police have, the one Fritz gave to the messenger. If my deduction is correct, that tin never left the building. You think the messenger is still in the hotel? I think the messenger is a committee member. No professional thief would risk a third-party courier for a task so delicate. The person who stood on my stoop yesterday was someone who knew they could pass for a regular employee. They didn't just take the saffron, they replaced it with a decoy to ensure Fritz wouldn't notice the weight difference. Archie, check the service lockers in the kitchen wing and find Avery Thorne. Tell him I'm interested in his choice of suppliers. If he blinks, follow the blink. I reached for my coat, the cold air from the hallway already seeping into the office. The gallery was set, the motives were clear, and the game was moving from the brownstone to the glittering ballrooms of the Waldorf. Harrison Vane, Julianne Van Heusen, Avery Thorne, and Marcus Bell. 4 people who thought they were clever enough to use Nero Wolfe as a prop in their play. They were about to find out the prop had teeth. "One more thing, Archie," Wolfe shouted as I reached the door. "If you see Saul, tell him to watch the ice, not the diamond. The ice." I didn't ask what he meant. I've learned that with Wolfe the metaphors are usually literal. I headed for the Heron, my mind racing through the suspects. The winter gala was only 5 hours away, and the clock was ticking faster than a heart on digitalis. The drive to the Waldorf Astoria was a battle against a city that had decided to freeze in place. The streets were choked with yellow cabs and delivery trucks, all of them shivering in the grey slush of Midtown. By the time I turned the Heron over to a valet, who looked like he wanted to trade his soul for a heater, my ears were ringing from the wind. Inside, the hotel was a different planet. All gold leaf, heavy carpets, and the hum of 300 people pretending they didn't have a care in the world. I moved through the lobby, dodging a phalanx of tuxedoed waiters and socialites dripping in enough carrots to sink a battleship. I didn't head for the ballroom. I headed for the service elevators and the kitchen wing maze. In my pocket, I had a small silver-plated nutmeg grater I'd lifted from Wolfe's kitchen. Not because I needed it, but because having a prop sometimes makes it easier to look like you belong. I found the kitchen in a state of controlled panic. With Chef Julian in the hospital, the line cooks were running around like chickens in a centrifuge, overseen by a man who could only be Avery Thorne. Thorne was a tall, skeletal man with a face that looked like it had been stretched over a frame of piano wire. He was screaming at a sous chef about the consistency of a sauce when I stepped into the steam and the noise. "Mr. Thorne, Nero Wolfe sent me," I said, pitching my voice just loud enough to cut through the clatter of copper pans. "He wanted me to return this. One of your messengers left it at the brownstone yesterday by mistake." I held out the nutmeg grater. Thorne stopped mid-shout, his eyes darting to the small silver object and then to my face. He didn't blink, but his nostrils flared. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor. "I don't know anything about a grater," Thorne snapped, his voice a dry rasp. And I don't have time for Nero Wolfe's riddles. We have 300 covers in 4 hours and a kitchen that's being run by amateurs. If you're not here to peel shallots, get out. Wolfe is more interested in the shallot peeler who visited us yesterday, I said, leaning against a stainless steel table. The one in the grey uniform. The one who brought Saffron back. Wolfe thinks he might have dropped something else, something much more valuable than a kitchen tool. Thorne's eyes flickered toward a row of lockers at the back of the prep area. It was a split-second movement, the kind of story Wolfe lives for. I told you, I don't know anything about it. Now leave, before I have security escort you to the sidewalk. I didn't wait to be asked twice. I moved toward the lockers, making it look like I was heading for the exit, but I detoured behind a rack of warming trays. I found Saul Panzer near the pastry station. He was wearing a green apron and was currently fussing over a centerpiece of spun sugar that looked like a frozen waterfall. Saul didn't look at me, but his voice was a low, steady murmur. Vane is in the security booth, Saul reported, his hands moving with the precision of a master gardener. The heiress, Julianne Van Heusen, is in the bridal suite on the 4th floor. She's been receiving a lot of visitors, mostly men in cheap suits who don't look like they're here to talk about the weather. And Archie, the lockers. Lock 402. Thorne has been opening it every 20 minutes since the police left. I nodded and circled back toward the locker row. The kitchen was a blur of motion, but I found 402 tucked behind a stack of flour sacks. I didn't need a key, a simple tension wrench and a bit of luck did the trick in under 30 seconds. Inside, there was no diamond. There was a grey uniform, a clipboard and a small square saffron tin. I opened the lid. The scent was overpowering, bitter, earthy and wrong. It wasn't just saffron, it was the decoy Wolfe had predicted. And hidden at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of Waldorf stationery, was a small hand-drawn map of the hotel's refrigeration system. I left the tin and headed for the bridal suite. If Thorne was the courier and the diamond was glass, the heiress was the one holding the chips. I found Julianne Van Heusen sitting on a velvet chaise longue, surrounded by enough luggage to sustain a small army. She was a beautiful woman, but her beauty was brittle, the kind that looks like it might shatter if you raised your voice. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice like ice cubes in a crystal glass. "My uncle's chairman told me to expect you. I assume you're here to tell me that Mr. Wolfe has recovered my diamond." "Not yet," I said, taking a seat opposite her without waiting to be asked, "but he has recovered the saffron, and a very interesting basement map. He's curious why an heiress would be so interested in the layout of the cold storage rooms." She didn't flinch. She just reached for a cigarette and lit it with a hand that was perfectly steady. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm a victim here, Mr. Goodwin. My family's legacy is in the hands of a thief. Your family's legacy is in the hands of a jeweler in Amsterdam if you don't start talking," I noted. "Wolfe knows about the textile debts. He knows the Glacier diamond was insured for twice its market value. And he knows it was you who suggested the saffron dish. It's a nice setup. Poison the chef to create a distraction, swap the diamond for glass and collect the insurance. But you made one mistake. You involved Nero Wolfe." She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You have no proof. Even if you found a tin of saffron in a locker, you can't link it to me. And as for the diamond, it's gone. You'll never find it." "Wolfe doesn't need to find it," I said, standing up. "He only needs to know where it's going to be at midnight. And I think I just found the answer in a locker downstairs." I walked out of the suite, feeling the weight of her gaze on the back of my neck. The sidewalks and sequins were just the surface. Underneath, the gears of the conspiracy were grinding toward a final germination. I headed for the service stairs, my mind on lock 402 and the map. The ice was starting to melt, and the truth was beginning to leak through the floorboards. I needed to get back to the brownstone, but I had one more stop to make. Harrison Vane was still in the security booth, and I wanted to see if his military precision extended to his alibi. I returned to the brownstone at 4 o'clock, the wind howling down 35th Street like a banshee with a toothache. I let myself in, and for the first time in years, the hallway didn't smell like Fritz's incomparable cooking. It smelled of nothing, a sterile, watchful silence that was more unnerving than a scream. I found Wolfe in the office, but he wasn't behind his desk. He was standing by the large globe, his back to the room, staring at the Atlantic Ocean as if he could see the diamond being rowed across it. "The Waldorf is a hive of very expensive bees, Wolfe," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack. "Thorne is sweating through his silk tie. The heiress is playing the Ice Queen in the bridal suite. And Lock 402 is holding enough evidence to keep a grand jury busy for a month. I found the uniform and the fridge system map. You were right about the messenger. Thorne was the legs, but Van Heusen was the brain." Wolfe didn't turn around. "And the saffron, Archie? Did you bring the tin from the locker?" "I left it where it was, just like you said, but I did something better. I accidentally dropped that nutmeg grater in Thorne's prep area. If he's as jumpy as he looks, he'll be moving the real cargo within the hour." "He will not move the diamond, Archie. He cannot. The security perimeter Harrison Vane has established is too tight for a physical extraction. They are waiting for the gala to begin, when the sheer volume of humanity will provide the necessary cover. But we have a more immediate problem. Look at the spice rack." I turned toward the small built-in cabinet where Fritz keeps the immediate use seasonings. It's a sacred space, usually organized with the precision of a pharmacy. One of the jars, a small crystal one that usually held whole nutmegs, was missing. In its place was a single white carnation, its stem cut at a sharp professional angle. "A subtle trespass," I murmured, feeling the hair on my arm stand up. "While I was at the Waldorf, someone was there, in the house, and they didn't come for the silver." "They came for the nutmeg," Wolfe said, turning finally. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. Fritz was in the basement, checking the furnace, and Theodore was in the plant rooms. The intruder entered through the service door, the same door the messenger used yesterday. They did not take the nutmeg because they were hungry, Archie. They took it because they knew I would notice its absence. It is a taunt, a reminder that my walls are no more secure than the Waldorf's vault. I checked the service door. The lock hadn't been picked. It had been opened with a key that shouldn't exist. "Harrison Vane," I said, the name tasting like lead. "He's the security chief for the committee. He's the one who would have had access to the floor plans of every building associated with the members, including this one, if Sterling's files were part of the audit." "Vane is the hand," Wolfe remarked, sitting heavily in his chair. "But the carnation is the signature of Marcus Bell. He is known in certain circles as the florist, a man who specializes in the delicate extraction of valuables under the cover of social events. He uses floral arrangements to hide surveillance equipment, tools, and occasionally stolen property. By taking the nutmeg and leaving the flower, he is telling me that he is currently in control of the ingredients of this case." The phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the tension. I picked it up. It was Saul Panzer, and he sounded like he was calling from the middle of a hurricane. "Archie, the ice sculpture just arrived at the ballroom," Saul reported. "It's a massive thing, a replica of the glacier diamond, 6 feet tall. Vane is personally supervising its placement. And Archie, the refrigeration map you found? The lines on it aren't for the hotel's walk-ins, they're for the internal cooling system of the sculpture itself." I looked at Wolfe and relayed the message. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just clicking, they were slamming into place. The missing nutmeg, the poisoned chef, the glass replica, and the refrigeration map. It wasn't just a heist, it was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. "The glacier diamond is not in a pocket or a safe," Wolfe said, his eyes glowing with a fierce intellectual light. "It is inside the ice. They used the saffron to remove the chef, ensuring that no expert eye would be near the ingredients. They traded stone for glass in the vault to provide a secondary distraction. But the real stone was placed inside the ice sculpture mold. As long as the sculpture remains frozen, the diamond is invisible, encased in the clouded center of the ice. When the gala ends and the sculpture is moved to the melting room, a standard procedure for large iceworks, the stone will simply drop into a collection tray. And the nutmeg, I asked, why steal a spice from your kitchen just to prove they could? "Because," Wolfe said, "nutmeg oil is a natural solvent for the specific polymer used to coat the diamond before it is frozen. It prevents the ice from bonding directly to the stone. ensuring it slips out cleanly when the temperature rises. They didn't have any on hand that wouldn't be tracked by the Waldorf's inventory. They stole mine to ensure that the final ingredient of their crime was as untraceable as the first. Wolfe reached for his beer, but he didn't drink. He held the glass up, watching the light catch the amber liquid. "They have trespassed in my house, Archie. They have stolen from my table, and they believe that because they are gilded, they are beyond the reach of justice. It is time to increase pressure. Call Saul. Tell him to find the thermostat for the ballroom. If Marcus Bell wants to play with ice, we shall give him a summer afternoon." I reached for the phone, my mind already on the next move. The subtle trespass had been a mistake. Marcus Bell and his committee had forgotten that while they were experts at the Gala, Nero Wolfe was the master of the brownstone. And in this house, nobody steals the nutmeg and gets away with it. The sun had begun to dip behind the jagged skyline of the west side, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-clogged streets. Inside the office, the light was failing, but Wolfe didn't signal for me to turn on the lamps. He sat in the twilight, a massive silhouette of indignation and intellect. The atmosphere in the brownstone had shifted from a state of curiosity to one of mobilization. We weren't just solving a robbery anymore, we were conducting a counter-siege. The shadows on the snow were no longer just the product of a winter evening. They were the invisible threads of a net Wolfe was casting over the Waldorf Astoria. "The second betrayal is always the most revealing, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low vibration in the gloom. "Marcus Bell believes that by leaving a carnation on my spice rack, he has established a dominant position. He is a man of theatre. He assumes that because I am sedentary, I am a spectator. We shall disabuse him of that notion. Have you reached Saul?" "He's on the line now," I said, handing Wolfe the receiver. "He's currently huddled in a utility closet near the ballroom. He says the ice sculpture is sweating." Wolfe took the phone, his face illuminated by the small green glow of the desk lamp I finally switched on. "Saul, listen carefully. The sculpture is not merely ice. It is a pressurized vessel. The nutmeg oil they stole will be applied to the base of the stone via a small induction heating element hidden in the pedestal. I want you to bypass the ballroom's main thermostat. Do not raise the temperature of the room. That would be noticed by the guests. Instead, I want you to find the coolant line for the pedestal itself. It will be a small insulated copper pipe. Serve it." I watched Wolfe's face. There was no joy in his expression, only the cold satisfaction of a mathematician correcting a sloppy equation. He hung up and looked at me. "The pressure is increasing, Archie. Not just for us, but conspirators. When that coolant line fails, the ice at the base of the sculpture will begin to degrade. The diamond will not drop into a collection tray at midnight. It will begin to shift within the hour. It will create a visible fracture in the glacier diamond replica. Marcus Bell and Harrison Vane will be forced to act prematurely." "And what about the second betrayal?" I asked. "You mentioned one." "The betrayal of Avery Thorne," Wolfe said. "He is the weakest link. He is a perfectionist who has been forced to partner with thugs. He is currently at the Waldorf, believing he is part of a sophisticated heist. He does not know that Marcus Bell and Julianne Van Heusen intend to leave him as the scapegoat for the poisoning. I want you to send a message to Thorne, not through the hotel switchboard, but through the service entrance messenger he used yesterday. Use the clipboard you found in lock 402. I spent the next hour working the phone and the shadows. I caught up with the messenger, a part-time waiter named Benny, who was more interested in his next tip than his criminal future. For $50 and the promise that I wouldn't tell the police about his side hustle, he agreed to deliver a note to Thorne. The note, written in Wolfe's own elegant, uncompromising hand, said only, "The nutmeg is back in the jar. The ice is melting. Bell has already left the airport." It was a lie, of course. Bell was still at the hotel, hovering over his floral arrangements like a vulture over a fresh kill. But in the world of high-stakes deception, a well-timed lie is often the only truth that matters. While I was out in the hall, the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't a client or a cop. It was a courier in a dark blue uniform. He didn't wait for me to open the door. He slid an envelope under it and vanished into the swirling snow. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy, long-distance shot of the brownstone's front door taken from the roof of the building across the street. On the back was a handwritten message, "Your walls are glass, Mr. Wolfe. Enjoy the gala." I brought the photo into the office. Wolfe stared at it long, his eyes as hard as the glacier diamond itself. "Suspicious surveillance," he murmured. "They are attempting to pin me to my chair, Archie. They want me to know that every move we make is being observed. They are trying to create an atmosphere of paranoia to prevent us from intervening at the Waldorf." "Is it working?" I asked, checking the load in my .38. "It is working in our favor," Wolfe said, a grim smile touching his lips. "By focusing their attention on this house, they are neglecting the subtle changes Saul is making to their masterpiece. They believe they are the hunters. It is a fatal error." Archie called Inspector Cramer. "Tell him to meet us at the Waldorf service entrance at 7, and tell him to bring a portable refrigeration unit. We are going to have a guest who requires a very specific climate." The shadows on the snow were lengthening and the cold was deepening, but the heat in the office was rising. Wolfe was no longer just orchestrating from his chair, he was positioning the suspects for a final public exposure. The winter gala was about to begin and the centerpiece was already starting to crack. "One more thing, Archie," Wolfe said as I reached for my coat. "Tell Fritz to prepare a small tray of crackers and a sharp cheddar. I find that when the enemy begins to use photography as a weapon, it is a sign of intellectual desperation. I shall require a light snack while I wait for the final germination." I headed for the door, the cold air hitting me like a physical blow. The pressure was at its peak, the betrayal was in motion, and Nero Wolfe was ready to turn the ballroom into a courtroom. The transition from the quiet, brooding atmosphere of the brownstone to the frenetic, artificial glitter of the Waldorf Astoria felt like a descent into a gilded cage. By 7, the hotel lobby was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, but the real movement was happening in the service corridors. I met Inspector Cramer near the freight elevator. He looked like he'd been chewed up by a blizzard and spit out into a society column. Beside him was a compact, humming portable refrigeration unit, exactly as Wolfe had requested. Kramer didn't look happy, but when Wolfe gives a specific instruction involving a $50 million diamond, even the NYPD tends to listen. "This better be it, Goodwin," Kramer grumbled, his voice a low rasp over the hum of the cooling unit. "I've got men stationed at every exit, but if that ice sculpture is just a block of frozen water, I'm going to personally see to it that Wolfe gets a bill for every man-hour I've wasted tonight." "Just watch the pedestal, Inspector," I said, checking the time, "and keep your eyes on Avery Thorne. He's the one who's about to find out that his partners have already checked out of the hotel. The master of ceremonies in this final act wasn't Wolfe, at least not physically. He was back on 35th Street, a massive presence at the end of a telephone line, but his influence was everywhere. I had Saul Panzer positioned near the ballroom's electrical panel, and I was moving through the crowd, looking for Marcus Bell. I found him near the ice sculpture. Up close, the glacier diamond replica was staggering, a 6-foot monolith of clouded, shimmering ice that stood in the center of the room. But as I approached, I saw what Wolfe had predicted. A hairline fracture, thin as a spider's silk, was snaking its way up from the base. The coolant line Saul had severed was doing its work. The internal temperature of the sculpture was rising, and the ice was beginning to weep. Marcus Bell was a man of immense poise, a professional who looked like he had been born in a tuxedo. But as he stared at that crack, I saw the mask slip. He looked at Harrison Vane, who was standing nearby with a walkie-talkie, and the two men shared a look of pure, unadulterated panic. The diamond wasn't supposed to drop for another 4 hours. Now it was a race against physics. "It's a beautiful evening, isn't it, Mr. Bell?" I said, stepping up beside him. I offered him a sharp, toothy smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Though I've heard that the humidity in these old ballrooms can be a real problem for ice, it almost looks like your masterpiece is catching a cold." Bell turned to me, his eyes cold and hard. "Mr. Goodwin, I wasn't aware you were on the guest list. I suggest you go back to the bar. The committee doesn't appreciate uninvited observers." Wolfe doesn't care much for appreciation, I noted, leaning in so only he could hear. But he does care about his spices. He wanted me to tell you that the nutmeg oil you used for the polymer coating is quite effective, but it has a very low melting point. Once the coolant line is cut, it acts as a lubricant. Your diamond is going to slide out of that ice and onto the floor in about 20 minutes, right in front of the mayor and 300 cameras. Bell didn't move, but his face turned a shade of grey that matched the winter sky outside. He signalled to Vane, and the two men began to move toward the sculpture, attempting to shield it from the view of the guests. But they were too late. Avery Thorne had seen me, and more importantly, he had seen the note I'd sent via Benny. He approached the sculpture from the opposite side, his face a mask of sweating, twitching terror. "Is it true?" Thorne hissed at Bell. "The police. Goodwin says you've already booked a flight." "You were going to leave me here with the poisoned chef and the glass replica?" "Shut up, Avery," Bell snapped, his voice a lethal whisper. "Get the tray. We moved it now. We tell the guests there's a structural flaw, and we take it to the melting room." This was the positioning Wolfe had orchestrated. By forcing their hand, he had turned a sophisticated heist into a panicked public scramble. As Vane and Bell moved to hoist the base of the sculpture, I gave the signal to Saul. The ballroom lights flickered once, then surged to a brilliant, unforgiving white, the full power of the Waldorf's house lights. The orchestra stopped mid-note. The guests turned, their conversations dying in their throats. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "if I could have your attention. It seems the Winter Gala has a very special surprise tonight, a demonstration of the Glacier Diamond's legendary clarity from the inside out." At that exact moment, the fracture in the ice widened with a sharp crystalline crack. The clouded center of the sculpture seemed to shift. A heavy, brilliant object, roughly the size of a goose egg, slid slowly out of the melting base and fell with a soft thud onto the velvet-covered pedestal. It wasn't glass. Under the glare of the house lights, it refracted the spectrum with a fire that made the sequins in the room look like dull coal. The Glacier Diamond sat, naked and cold, before 300 witnesses. Bell and Vane were frozen, their hands still on the ice, caught in the ultimate spotlight. Kramer stepped out from the shadows of the service door, his badge gleaming in his hand. "I think that's our cue, Inspector," I said, stepping back to let the police move in. The master of ceremonies had finished his work. The ice had melted, the shadows had been chased away by the light, and the gilded thieves were left holding nothing but a block of freezing water. I looked at the diamond, then the phone in the hallway. I needed to call Wolfe. He'd be waiting to hear if the nutmeg oil had performed as expected, and more importantly, if the cheddar was as sharp as the trap he'd set. The office was no longer a room in a brownstone. It had become a court of final appeal, chilled by the winter air and the glacial presence of the man behind the desk. It was nearly midnight. Outside, the city was a frozen landscape of silence, but inside, the air was heavy with the scent of wet wool and the sharp, clinical smell of the portable refrigeration unit that sat on the parquet floor like a metallic coffin. The suspects were arranged in a semicircle of red leather chairs, their finery now looking like discarded costumes. Julianne Van Heusen sat on the far left, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she still believed her social standing could act as a shield. Beside her, Avery Thorne was a ruin of a man, his tuxedo damp with perspiration, his hands clutching a silk handkerchief as if it were a life raft. Harrison Vane sat with a rigid military posture, his eyes fixed on the refrigeration unit with a gaze that was both wary and defiant. Marcus Bell, the florist, sat on the far right, his composure regained but his eyes narrowed to predatory slits. Nero Wolfe was back in his throne, his yellow silk vest a splash of defiant color in the center of the room. On his desk, sitting on a square of black velvet, was the Glacier Diamond. Beside it sat the missing crystal jar of nutmeg. The juxtaposition of a $50 million stone and a kitchen spice was the ultimate Wolfe signature, a reminder that in this house all variables are equal under the law of logic. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, "to discuss a failure of character masquerading as a success of engineering. You believed, Mr. Bell, that by utilizing the properties of ice and the volatility of digitalis, you could create a crime that was both invisible and untraceable. You assumed that because you are masters of the gilded world, you could use my home as a convenient way station for your logistics. It was a fatal miscalculation." Wolfe's eyes moved to Avery Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, you were the architect of the diversion. You utilized your position as coordinator to orchestrate the clerical error that brought the saffron to my door. You then sent a messenger, yourself in a grey uniform, to retrieve it, replacing it with a decoy. But you were not merely a thief, you were a witness. You saw the nutmeg oil in my kitchen and realized it was the perfect lubricant for the polymer coating the stone would require inside the ice. You stole it, not out of necessity, but out of a desperate desire for perfection. You wanted the diamond to drop cleanly into your hand at midnight." Thorne let out a strangled sob. "They told me it was the only way. They said if the gala failed, my reputation would be destroyed anyway. I just wanted the risotto to be perfect." "The risotto was a vessel for poison, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe snapped, his voice like a crack of a whip. "And you, Miss Van Heusen, were the primary beneficiary. Your textile debts in Europe are not merely substantial, they are ruinous. You required the insurance payout from the theft of the diamond, but you also require the diamond itself to be sold on the black market to satisfy the men who do refuse insurance claims as collateral. You provided the access to the Van Heusen vault and the suggestion of the saffron dish, knowing it would provide the necessary cover for the swap." Julian Van Heusen didn't flinch. "You have no proof, Mr. Wolfe. A missing nutmeg jar and a melting ice sculpture are not evidence of a conspiracy. I was a gala guest. I have no connection to the kitchen staff." "The connection is in the refrigeration map Archie found in lock 402, Wolfe remarked, gesturing toward me. "A map that was drawn on your personal stationery, which bears a very specific watermark, only available to members of your family, and as for the Ice Queen Act, it is currently thawing. Harrison Vane, your military precision was your undoing. You established a security perimeter that was so tight it actually trapped your own theft inside. When Saul Panzer severed the coolant line to the pedestal, he didn't just melt the ice, he forced you to choose between the diamond and your alibi. You chose the diamond, and in doing so, you stepped into the light." Vane shifted in his chair, his jaw set. "The stone was glass when I checked it this morning, Wolfe. You saw it yourself. If it turns back into a diamond in the ice, that's a miracle, not a crime." "It is not a miracle, it is a displacement," Wolfe said. "The glass replica was the stone that was stolen. No real stone left the Waldorf. It was moved from the vault to the ice mold 48 hours ago, before the security audit even began. The theft this morning was a staged event to ensure that when the gala began, the police would be looking for a missing stone rather than watching a block of ice. It was a double blind, Mr. Bell, and the nutmeg oil was the final touch. But there is one ingredient you forgot." Wolfe picked up the nutmeg jar. "Nutmeg oil leaves a very specific chemical signature on a diamond's surface, a microscopic film that persists for hours. My agents at the New York Police Department lab have already confirmed that the stone on my desk bears the exact chemical profile of the oil from my kitchen. It is a signature that links the glacier diamond directly to the messenger who stood on my stoop yesterday." Marcus Bell stood up, his face a mask of cold, concentrated fury. "You've made a mistake, Wolfe. Even if you link the oil to the stone, you can't link the stone to me. I never touched it. You touched the carnation," Wolfe said, his eyes glowing with a fierce intellectual light. "The flower you left on my spice rack. The pollen on that flower is a rare hybrid from your own conservatory, a hybrid that is currently blooming nowhere else in the city. You left your calling card in my sanctuary, Mr. Bell. In doing so, you provided the final link in the chain. The florist has been caught by his own bouquet. Kramer stepped out from behind the globe, his badge catching the light. "I think that's our verdict, Wolfe. The cold room is open and the suspects are ready for a different kind of ice." The office gathering was over. The gilded thieves were led out into the freezing night, their finery now a badge of their failure. Wolfe didn't move. He sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the glacier diamond, a man who had finally seen the truth emerge from the melting ice. The office had settled into a state of crystalline clarity that usually follows the breaking of a long, feverish heat. Inspector Cramer had departed with his retinue, taking Marcus Bell, Harrison Vane, and the shivering Avery Thorne into the cold Manhattan night. Julianne Van Heusen had gone as well, though she walked to the police car with a terrifying, frozen dignity that suggested she was already mentally calculating which of her social connections could survive a grand jury. That left the three of us, Wolfe, the Glacier Diamond, and me. The clock on the mantel ticked with a sharp, rhythmic precision that seemed to underscore the finality of the evening. Wolfe was leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his fingers tap-tap-tapping against the arms of his chair. He was in that state of intellectual repose that I've come to recognize as the post-mortem. He wasn't thinking about the arrests, he was thinking about the logic. I sat at my desk, my notebook open, waiting for the one piece of the puzzle that still felt like it was missing a corner. "The Thor of deception, Archie," he said, his voice a low, resonant vibration. "It is always more revealing than the frieze itself." Marcus Bell believed that by hiding his prize in a block of ice, he had achieved the ultimate state of entropy. He assumed that because the diamond was physically unreachable, it was intellectually invisible. He forgot that the more a man attempts to control the environment of his crime, the more he leaves behind the signatures of his own interference. He leaned forward, finally reaching for the small crystal jar of nutmeg. He didn't handle it with the reverence of a collector. He handled it with the domestic familiarity of a man who knows the value of his own pantry. Nutmeg oil was the pivot, Archie. Without it, the diamond would have bonded to the ice during the freezing process. When the ice melted, the stone would have remained encased in a jagged, visible core, necessitating a mechanical extraction that would have drawn attention. They needed a clean release. They needed the oil to act as a hydrophobic barrier. I watched him as he spoke, realizing that the logic of the case had been moving beneath our feet like a subterranean river, while I was out chasing messengers and dodging security chiefs. "You knew about the oil the moment the jar went missing, didn't you?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "That's why you weren't worried about the surveillance photo. You knew they were desperate for the last ingredient." Wolfe gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I knew that Marcus Bell was a man of patterns. He is a florist. He understands the chemistry of preservation and the mechanics of the display. When I realized that the nutmeg had been taken, I understood that the Glacier Diamond was not being stolen in the conventional sense. It was being cultivated. It was being grown into the center of that ice sculpture. The poisoning of Chef Julian was not merely a distraction. It was a necessity to ensure that no one with an expert knowledge of the kitchen's thermal cycles would be present to notice the unusual settings on the walk-in freezers. The revelation hit me then. The entire confrontation in the ballroom, the severed coolant line, the brilliant lights, it was all a distraction from the fact that Wolfe had already won the war in the kitchen hours ago. The theft the committee was fighting for was already a ghost by the time the ice started to sweat. "But what about the second betrayal?" I asked. Thorne seemed convinced that Bell was going to leave him holding the bag. Wolfe's face went hard. He was. Marcus Bell had no intention of sharing the Glacier Diamond proceeds with a nervous coordinator or a bankrupt heiress. He intended to use the melting room as his primary exit. He would have retrieved the stone, replaced it with a second glass replica in the melting tray, and left Thorne to explain why the stone found in the slush was a counterfeit. The compliments of the season note was the ultimate insult. It was intended to make the police believe that the entire affair was a prank or a vendetta involving this house, drawing the heat away from the actual black market transaction. I looked at the diamond, the brilliant fire of the stone now appearing like a dark, ancient seal. It was a lot of treachery for a few carats of carbon and a jar of spice. But as I watched Wolfe, I realized that for him, the case was never about the value of the stone. It was about the affront to his own sense of order. Someone had used the intellectual pursuit of high society to mask the physical pursuit of theft, and in Nero Wolfe's universe, that is the one sin that cannot be edited out of the record. The DA will have a field day with the watermarked stationery and the pollen samples, I noted, closing my notebook. But with Van's security logs and the residue on the stone, they've got enough to seal the lid on Marcus Bell for good. And the chef is expected to fully recover. He's already asking for his saffron back. The lid is already sealed, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a tone of finality. The winter gala will be remembered as the night the ice broke, and the gilded world will have to find a new way to entertain itself. The secret is out, the nutmeg is back in its place, and the air is clear. Now, if you please, tell Fritz that the cheddar was indeed acceptable, but I should like a small glass of the port to settle the palate. Victory over the arrogant is always more satisfying when accompanied by a proper digestive. I stood up, feeling the weight of the night finally start to lift. The reveal was complete, the logic was sound, and the winter gala conspiracy had been filed under closed. I headed for the kitchen, the smell of the cold night finally being pushed out of the house by the warmth of the office fire. The following morning, the brownstone had reclaimed its usual atmosphere of heavy, scholarly peace, as if the ghosts of the winter gala had been exorcised by the mere act of scrubbing the office floor. The sun was hitting the back of the house, casting long golden rectangles across the parquet where the gilded committee had sat in judgment of themselves only hours before. I had spent the early hours at the precinct, dealing with the kind of paperwork that makes you wish you'd taken up a simpler profession like ice harvesting in the Yukon. By the time I walked back into the office at 11, the city outside was humming with its usual chaotic energy, but inside, the air was as still as a frozen pond. Wolfe was in his chair, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at the space on his spice rack where the nutmeg jar had been returned to its rightful place. The glacier diamond was gone, taken as evidence by two men in suits who looked like they'd never seen anything that didn't have a tracking number. In its place was a fresh bottle of beer and a small, delicate sprig of an orchid I didn't recognize, something Theodore had brought down to signal that the world was once again focused on things that grew rather than things that were frozen. "The DA is happy, Wolfe," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack and sliding into my chair. "Kramer says Julianne Van Heusen's lawyers are already trying to negotiate a deal that involves her turning state's witness against Marcus Bell in exchange for a suspended sentence and a very long trip to a quiet estate in Connecticut. They've got Harrison Vane on the hook for the security breach, and Avery Thorne is busy telling anyone who will listen that he was under duress. It's a regular festival of finger-pointing." Wolfe didn't look up. He poured his beer with a steady hand, the head forming a perfect creamy inch at the top of the glass. "The happiness of the district attorney is a matter of supreme indifference to me, Archie. Solution integrity is what matters. A problem has been posed, its variables have been analyzed, and its conclusion has been reached. The fact that it also happens to involve the dismantling of a social parasite scheme is merely a pleasant side effect. Pleasant for us, maybe, not so much for the Van Heusen estate," I noted. "They're currently at a hotel in Midtown, wondering if they're going to be the next ones to be audited by the insurance company. Sterling told me to tell you that he's never going to host another gala as long as he lives, which might be the only good thing to come out of this entire mess." Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep subterranean skepticism. "Mr. Sterling is a man who preferred the comfort of a gilded title to the effort of a genuine moral compass. He was the chairman of a vanity project, and he was content to stay in the dark as long as the diamonds were shiny. He deserves his headache. It is a small price to pay for the audacity of allowing his associates to use this house as a warehouse for their malice." Fritz came in then, carrying a tray with a small covered dish and a fresh pot of coffee. He looked at the spot where the refrigeration unit had sat and gave the rug a suspicious squint as if he expected a puddle of melted deception to manifest out of thin air. "Everything is in order, Archie?" he asked, his voice a comfortingly domestic baritone. "As in order as it ever gets, Fritz," I said, leaning back. "The air is clear, the ice has melted, and the only things left in this house that are cold are the beers in the refrigerator." Fritz nodded, satisfied, and retreated to the kitchen. A few minutes later, the elevator groaned, that familiar sound of the mountain returning to the plains, and the rhythmic thud of Wolfe's footsteps signaled the end of his midday session. He had spent the last hour with the orchids, a ritual that always seems to reset his internal clock after a brush with the ugliness of human ambition. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant vibration, "tell Saul that his bonus for the electrical work will be processed this afternoon, and remind him, if he ever again uses a utility closet as a command center, I shall expect him to provide a more sophisticated explanation for the smell of floor wax on his jacket." "I'll tell him," I said, smiling at my typewriter. "But I think he's more worried about the cold he caught while standing next to that ice sculpture. He says his nose feels like it's been through a meat locker." Wolfe settled back into his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He looked at the clock on the mantel, then at the spice rack. "The Winter Gala conspiracy was a lesson in the dangers of the fixed idea, Archie. Marcus Bell believed his gilded reputation could buy silence. Julianne Van Heusen believed her debt could be erased by a swap of glass for stone. They all forgot that the truth is the only ingredient that cannot be substituted in the kitchen of justice. It has a way of surfacing, even when it has been frozen in a block of ice." He reached for his book, a thick volume on the history of the Silk Road, and I knew the case was officially filed away in the archives of his mind. The Winter Gala was no longer a mystery, it was a memory, and for Wolfe, memories are only useful if they can be used to solve the next problem. I stood up and went to the window, looking out at the street. The afternoon traffic was picking up, and a delivery truck was double-parked near the corner. It was a normal, noisy, chaotic Manhattan day. The diamond was gone, the air was clear, and Nero Wolfe was back in his world, where the only thing that mattered was the next meal and the next bloom. It was a good day to be alive on West 35th Street, even if the world was a little less gilded than it had been yesterday. "And Archie," Wolfe's voice drifted from behind the book. "Yeah? Tell Fritz that for lunch tomorrow, I should like the braised short ribs with the horseradish reduction. My palate requires something sharp after the cloying sweetness of Marcus Bell's floral arrangements." "Short ribs and horseradish," I repeated, heading for the kitchen. "I think we can manage that, just as long as we don't have to melt anything to get to it." The office door closed behind me, sealing in the silence. The case was finished, the accounts were settled, and the only thing left to do was wait for the doorbell to ring again.